Good evening. How are you all? Pleasure to have you here. We have a very interesting forum tonight, as you can see, and we'll have some spirited and enthusiastic. Leon, how are you? You see, Leon and I share a remarkable distinction with all of the public acclaim and the things we've done. We both went into the Alfalfa Club at the same time, and that's all you need to know. It's the craziest outfit in the world, and it's good to see him again. Today we were a little delayed trying to see that everyone that was slogging through this peculiar weather would make it. We don't have this kind of weather in Wyoming. This is impossible. Cruel, harsh. Umbrella, it looks like a siphon. It's just twisted backwards. My hat, hairpiece, all of it gone. But not bad, though. It was so cold in Cheyenne the other day, I saw a lawyer going down the street with his hands in his own pockets. And now we're going to get right to the issue here. Right to the issue. I welcome you. Thank the students who co-sponsored this event, and it's a remarkable group of sponsors. The program on constitutional government, Shorenstein Center on Press Politics and Public Policy, the Du Bois Institute, the Student Council here, the Harvard Black Student Association, the Association of Black Radcliffe Women, the Kennedy School Black Student Caucus, the Harvard Radcliffe College Democrats, the Harvard Radcliffe Republican Alliance, and the Harvard Republican Club. That ought to cover it pretty well. And so we will have the format where we will have each of these panelists speak for 8 to 10 minutes. I'm going to go in this order. Abigail Thernstrom first, and then Larry Lawrence Bobo and Keith Reeves and Stephen Thornstrom. Abigail Thernstrom is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a co-author with her husband, Stephen, of America in Black and White, One Nation Indivisible. One of the three authors chosen by the president to participate in his first town meeting on race in Akron, Ohio this past September, author of Whose Vote Counts, Whose Votes Count, Affirmative Action and Minority Voting Rights, which was named Best Policy Studies Book of the Year by the Political Studies Organization, appeared on numerous talk shows, NewsHour, Lair, Both Sides with Jesse Jackson, writer for the New Republic, Commentary, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and the Public Interest. Lawrence D. Bobo, professor of Afro-American Studies and Sociology at Harvard, was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences and a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation, researches racial attitudes, race relations, social psychology, public opinion, and public behavior. Co-author of the award-winning book Racial Attitudes in America, appearances on the Today Show, CBS Sunday Morning, Nightline on CNN, currently working on a book on the sociology of prejudice. Keith Reeves, my classmate at the Shorenstein Center last year, right down the hall as we celebrated the birth of his daughter and other things. Assistant professor of public policy at the Kennedy School, also a political campaign consultant, author of the new book Voting Hopes or Fears, White Voters, Black Candidates, and Racial Politics in America. Specializes in ascertaining the impact of racial politics on electoral behavior and public policy issues, and was a 1990-1991 Henry Luce Scholar. Stephen Thornstrom, a Winthrop Professor of History at Harvard, co-author with wife Abigail of America in Black and White, One Nation Indivisible, awarded fellowships by the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Social Science Research Council, the John M. Olin Foundation, winner of the Bancroft Prize in American History and numerous other awards from publishers, has written for the New Republic, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Dissent, the Public Interest, and the Times Literary Supplement. And with that, we'll proceed to the panelists in that form, and they may use the podium or sit as they desire. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Simpson. It is indeed wonderful to see this incredible crowd on this terrible rainy night. Well, the ostensible topic today is the politics of civil rights. I'm going to discuss the good news about black progress that is always politically incorrect to deliver. Bad news about the status of blacks, the state of race relations, that's always a political winner, or at least the politically safe ground on which to stand. Gloom and doom seem caring and racially sensitive, when in fact I would argue that that voice is a self-inflicted racial wound, making conditions worse, not better. Nevertheless, the bad news industry, I think, is about to gear up once again. I mean, it never disappears, but it will be more evident this coming weekend. Sunday will be the 30th anniversary of the Kerner Commission report, and that will, I think, inevitably be an occasion for saying, when it comes to the status of blacks and the state of race relations, nothing has changed. Indeed, things may have gotten worse, some will argue, since 1968. A few words on the Kerner Commission. I'm going to spend my few moments talking about it. Appointed by President Johnson in the wake of the wave of terrible urban riots in the mid-1960s, it was formerly known as the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, and it was chaired by Otto Kerner, who was governor of Illinois. Its task was to explain the racial violence in which almost 300 Americans died, with another 8,000 injured, and to propose a cure. It did neither well. Central finding of the commission, it may be known better than the Pledge of Allegiance in this country. The nation, the report said, was, quote, moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Subsequent years, that ominous prediction became a civil rights mantra. Two societies, deepening racial division, movement apart, that is the picture that is still drawn by most writers on race. But while the Kerner report is generally viewed as absolutely the last word, in fact, I believe it was close to worthless in 1968 and has become even more so over time. Take the question of the cause of the riots that began in '65 in the Los Angeles ghetto, Watts. The Kerner Commission fingered what has become the usual suspect, that is white racism. In fact, the cause of that violence remains obscure even to this day. Detroit was the city that was hardest hit. There were 2,500 stores destroyed, 43 citizens killed, 7,200 arrested. But Detroit was hardly a vast slum, a tinderbox ready to explode. City's auto industry was booming. Black unemployment rate was a minuscule 3.4%. Black home ownership rate was the highest in the country. The income of the typical black family in Detroit was a mere 6% behind that of the average white family. In Los Angeles, too, where the riots began, the economy was humming along nicely. Indeed, in 1964, a year before the riot, the National Urban League had rated Los Angeles best city in the country for blacks. And remarkably, serious rioting never occurred in the South, where life for blacks was unquestionably harder, meaner, and obviously where there was much more white racism. The riots, in fact, came and went mysteriously. Nevertheless, the commission warned of inevitable further violence, the consequence of ever blacker cities and white suburbs, ringed by white suburbs. That was the central prediction of the report. Blacks increasingly trapped in urban ghettos while whites mowed their lawns, American apartheid, separate lives in separate places, rampant inequality, and growing racial hostility. It was a grim but mesmerizing fantasy. In 1968, only one of the nation's, the year of the report, only one of the nation's top 20 cities was actually majority black, and the second migration of southern blacks to the north was already petering out. Thus, in the next 2 decades, only 3 more cities became more than 50% black. And down the road in the 1980s, the black proportion of the population would actually shrink in Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, and DC, while remaining constant in other important places. In addition, the list of the nation's largest cities changed over time, and among those that grew most rapidly, most had a very small black population. In fact, Otto Kerner and his colleagues had closed their eyes to 2 stories. Immigration was the second. 3 years before the report, a drastic revision of immigration law in this country such that a flood of Hispanics and Asians soon changed the urban landscape. Today, Hispanics outnumber blacks in Los Angeles and in 5 other top 20 cities, while more Asians than blacks live in 3 others. We're talking here just about the top 20. Black cities and white suburbs. The second prediction about all white suburbs was also way off. By 1970, blacks were again on the move, this time away from cities in which they were allegedly trapped. It was a third great migration, almost totally ignored in the literature on race, but in fact, in terms of sheer numbers, much more dramatic than that precipitated by World War II. Thus, between 1970 and 1995, 7 million blacks moved to the suburbs, a number considerably larger than the 4.4 million that had moved from the south to the north in the 1940s to 1970. In those decades, the white suburban population grew a strong 63%. There was a lot of white suburbanization taking place, but the black suburban population increased 3 times as fast. Today, 1/3 of all blacks live in suburbia, twice the number just 25 years ago. Of course, suburbs can be one race, but most of them are not. And the typical neighborhood within our central cities as well has become more integrated. 1964, only 1 in 5 white Americans said they had any black neighbors. Today, the figure is 3 out of 5, a national average that, of course, includes places like Vermont and Utah, where almost no blacks live. And 5 out of 6 blacks now say they have white neighbors. The typical black resident of a metropolitan area today lives in a census block group that is not 100% black or 90 or 80, but 60% black. Now, you can say 60% black, well, that's still a high black concentration, too segregated. And it is. Nevertheless, name a group whose members are randomly distributed across the residential landscape. In Massachusetts, Jews tend to gravitate towards Brookline, Armenians to Watertown, Portuguese to Fall River, Cambodians to Lowell, Hispanics to Lawrence, and so forth. Blacks do want integrated neighborhoods, but like other groups, not neighborhoods, surveys suggest, in which their numbers are proportional to their percentage in the American population, that is 12.4%. Integration, blacks say, means roughly half black, a figure that's not so far off the current average of 60% black. I am not saying there is no housing discrimination. There is. And I am not saying that in a society in which blacks did not feel more welcome in white neighborhoods, that desirable 50-50 mix might not change. It might. Nevertheless, I find those numbers interesting. 10 years ago, on the 20th anniversary of the Kerner Commission report, 14 notable scholars, including William Julius Wilson, who's now here, released a volume that spoke of ongoing, quote-unquote, quiet riots. Even more, the quote continues, even more destructive of human life than the violent riots of 20 years ago. Conditions unchanged, perhaps even worse. This has become the unwavering message of civil rights spokesmen and of too many scholars. In a much-cited book entitled American Apartheid, authors Massey and Denton claim that, quote, almost every problem defined by the Kerner Commission has become worse. Andrew Hacker's best-selling book, Two Nations, was much in the same vein. In fact, it's not only with respect to residential patterns, but as well with regard to, income, schooling. Well, I'll skip over this point to say, look, many, many measures of black progress. Is all the news good news? Of course all the news is not good news. We know the bad news. But the good news is seldom broadcast. 30 years after the Kerner Commission released its findings, it's time to bury that 1968 report. It's had a sad but very influential life. Gloom is a self-fulfilling prophecy. I want a new self-fulfilling mantra. It would go, much progress, still much to do. And that would serve us well, and it would be the whole truth and nothing but. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Professor Lawrence Bobo, please. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. The one thing I can say about Boston as a resident of Los Angeles moving here in the past few months is that you guys are generally bad drivers, and you're really bad drivers when it rains. But to turn to our topic here this evening, if I had known we were going to spend so much time looking back to 1968, I'd have worn my dashiki and a beret. But I want to set a different tone here. And it really is a tone about genuine honesty, not strained and somehow mean-spirited optimism. As the 20th century draws to a close, we've entered a period of intensified re-examination of the problem of black-white relations and of racial and ethnic diversity in general for American society. The great anxiety and doubt is evident from the titles of a score of books, including my colleague Cornel West's Race Matters, Doug Massey and Nancy Denton's American Apartheid, Lonnie Guinier's The Tyranny of the Majority, Jim Sleeper's Liberal Racism, and David Shipler's A Country of Strangers, to name a few. More remarkable, perhaps, is the emergence in the mainstream of powerful voices of utter pessimism about race relations. Two such voices stand out. Andrew Hacker, in his provocative book, Two Nations, Black and White, Separate, Hostile, and Unequal, concluded that the United States confronts a, quote, huge racial chasm, and there are few signs that the coming century will see it closed. Civil rights activist and legal scholar Derek Bell, in his book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Racism, is a good deal more blunt. Quote, racism is an integral, permanent, and indestructible component of this society. Now, Hacker and Bell, to be fair, do not offer static arguments. However, the trends heralded as gains and progress by many analysts to them fall well short of genuine improvements in race relations. I depart from them somewhat, but want to be honest about where we really stand. There's this sense in which talking about racism is pessimism, that it's a self-inflicted wound. Well, in this case, I'd like to quote Dr. Martin Luther King, who in his final book said, "How strange it would be to condemn a physician who, through persistent work and the ingenuity of his medical skills, discovered cancer in a patient. Would anyone be so ignorant as to say he caused the cancer?" By way of overview, let me make 3 points. First, the available data suggests that the U.S. has experienced a genuine positive transformation in racial attitudes. A once predominant ideology of Jim Crow racism has, over the past 5 decades, steadily receded from view. Nonetheless, both Hacker and Bell, I believe, are correct to talk of a modern problem of racism, as, quite frankly, was the Kerner Commission. The collapse of Jim Crow racism has not been followed by a full embrace of African Americans as true co-equals with whites, deserving of a complete measure of all the fruits of membership in the polity. Instead, I submit to you that a new configuration of racial attitudes has recently crystallized. I refer to this new pattern as laissez-faire racism. It involves persistent stereotyping of African Americans, a tendency to blame blacks themselves for the black-white gap in socioeconomic standing, and resistance to meaningful policy efforts to ameliorate racist social conditions and institutional practices. Of course, prior to World War II, Jim Crow racism was a widely, popularly accepted ideology in the U.S. It was nationally endorsed. Today, most Americans, white Americans, flat out reject the idea that we ought to be a segregated society, flat out reject the idea that we ought to be a society that condones traditional affirmative action, that is, preference for whites and access to jobs. Reject the idea that blacks are, in fact, the inherent intellectual inferiors of whites. That's all to the good. It's tremendous progress. It's a remarkable transformation. Unfortunately, these momentous changes simply herald a transformation in the nature of anti-black prejudice, not an end to it. Negative stereotypes about African Americans remain widespread in the United States. A major national study that I designed in 1990 showed some 78% of white Americans perceived blacks as preferring to live off of welfare. Some 65% perceived blacks as lazier than whites. Some 58% said blacks were more prone to violence. And 56% said that blacks were less intelligent than whites. What is more, most white Americans still blame black Americans or African American culture for any remaining social disadvantages that blacks face. There is burgeoning evidence that these sort of negative stereotypes have profound effects. They definitely reduce the willingness of many white Americans to entertain the possibility of living in integrated neighborhoods. And let me talk a bit about what the attitude data show here quickly. Abigail is right. There's been a terrific improvement in white willingness to have black neighbors. And many whites are telling us now in surveys that, yes, indeed, I have a black person in my neighborhood. So one black person, I'm the guy in Brookline, is the one that a lot of these guys are talking about. But more to the point, we conducted a major survey in LA County in 1994. We asked all of our respondents to design their own ideal neighborhood. We gave them a blank page. Write in the mixture of groups you'd like to see in your own neighborhood. The findings are stunning. Number one, African Americans are the group most likely to create integrated living conditions. That's contrasting them to Latinos, to Asians, and in particular to whites. Number two, the group most likely to create a homogeneous same-race neighborhood, white Americans. 1 in 10 did so in LA County in 1994. Envision that, a majority-minority city where fully 10% of the white population said, I'd prefer to be in an all-white neighborhood. I want you to, each and every one of you on your own, ponder the implications of that for the possibility of ever achieving stable residential integration. Number three, fully 20% of whites created integrated neighborhoods that excluded African Americans. That is, they were willing to have Latinos and Asians as neighbors, but not blacks. Second, in terms of this mantra of optimism and progress, there are virtually no African Americans in the white middle class. Let me say that again. There are virtually no African Americans in the white middle class. Today's black middle class is larger and more secure than ever before, to be sure, perhaps as much as a third of the black population. This milestone achievement, however, is easily misperceived and exaggerated. The black middle class still earns less, faces greater difficulty in obtaining occupational mobility, and faces far greater risks of unemployment than otherwise comparable whites. But the key thing that matters are the accumulated differences in assets, in wealth. For example, the median level of wealth in white households estimated by my former colleague Melvin Oliver is $43,800, compared to a meager $3,700 in black households. In terms of net financial assets, subtracting the debts, the figures are $6,900 for whites to zero. That divides out to a huge ratio, by the way. Taking a college degree as an indicator of middle-class status, Oliver and Shapiro show net financial assets of $19,823 for white college graduates as compared to a whole $175 among blacks. That is, a good dinner over at Henrietta's table. It's a mistake to draw inferences about the status of African Americans from that rarefied segment of the black population who now travel among the elite. But more than this, the African American population remains heavily segregated. It's true, blacks have moved increasingly to the suburbs. It may even be the case we're on the verge of seeing more stable residential integration. I'm not going to forecast beyond what I see, given the other dynamics around me, but a heck of a lot of almost exclusively black suburbs have also emerged. This is in part directly traceable to discrimination by realtors, landlords, lenders, and insurance companies. Furthermore, and perhaps crucially, the black middle class must still struggle against a popular American culture that is sickeningly distorted by rumors of black inferiority. There is no clearer proof of this than the publication in extraordinary cells of an 800-page tome called The Bell Curve, which puts back on the national table for discussion, consumption, and discourse whether or not African Americans are genetically less intelligent. Let me move on to a third point here. Poor and working class African Americans face barriers to opportunity based in both class and race. It's true that all workers, irrespective of race, especially low-skilled workers, have seen an increasingly globalized, high-technology economy drive down their wages and standard of living. Nonetheless, research involving carefully designed audits, involving systematic surveys of employers, involving in-depth interviews with low-skill employers, involving interviews with African Americans themselves, all suggest one thing. Direct racial bias against African Americans, even at the very lowest end of the work scale, still occurs today. Continued race bias in the labor market and residential segregation help account for why a far larger fraction of the black poor, as compared to the white poor, have incomes at 50% or less of the official poverty line. Let me say it again. African Americans are 3 times more likely to be at 50% or less the national poverty line. Fourth, the challenge of the 21st century will be to constructively engage the race divide without being completely defined by it. We will not accomplish this end by pretending that socially meaningful racial distinctions are gone. We will not accomplish this end by pretending that because we've gotten rid of a truly barbaric form of racism, that all racism has disappeared. As Martin Luther King said, again, in Where Do We Go From Here, quote, "The absence of brutality and unregenerate evil is not the presence of justice." And I will stop there for now.
Thank you. And now Professor Keith Reeves. Whoop. They'll do that here.
Stage is coming apart.
You never know what they're up to here.
I brought a little earthquake from California.
It's part of the vast right-wing conspiracy.
I'm willing to buy
We're
that.
coming to that. Professor Keith Reeves. Keith, if you would now wish to take
I'm going to stay here.
whatever you wish.
I'm going to stay here if people can hear me.
Okay.
Let me pick up where Larry left off. Good evening first. Among social scientists, it has been virtually beyond debate that there have been incremental alterations in the country's social landscape where blacks are concerned. In the aftermath of the civil rights campaigns of the 1950s and 1960s, most whites, too, have come to endorse broad principles of non-discrimination and desegregation in education, politics, and housing. Still, despite these monumentous changes, when one canvasses the contemporary state of race relations, one is left with the distinct impression that in many ways the relations between blacks and whites are far more complex than a generation ago. On many levels, contemporary race relations resemble at best an uneasy truce across the racial divide. While there is much that black and white Americans agree upon, both groups see and acknowledge a discomforting racial divide. Clearly for blacks, the state of race relations is far more salient than it is for whites. For instance, while 7 out of 10 blacks believe that improving race relations is one of the most important things needed for the future of the country, just 3 in 10 whites concur. Let me just repeat that again. Just 3 in 10 whites concur. Moreover, most blacks believe that race still impacts their life chances and opportunities, while whites tend to believe that blacks have an equal chance to succeed in life. In fact, the overwhelming majority of whites believe that relative to the average white, blacks have as good or better access to health care, education, and jobs. Even in income and housing, where the clearest discrepancies exist according to government statistics, more than 4 out of 10 whites believe that the average black is at least as well off as the average white American. While in these areas, whites see blacks as equal, if not superior, on virtually every other social dimension, they view them rather unfavorably. For example, many whites believe that blacks are less intelligent than whites, speak English more poorly than whites, are more difficult to get along with than whites, and prefer more so than whites to live off welfare rather than being self-supporting. The central point, according to conservative academics Paul Snyderman and Thomas Piazza, is this: that in spite of positive incremental changes in racial attitudes, negative characterizations of blacks remain prevalent. What this complex web of racial attitudes has meant for race relations is fairly self-evident. What it means for crucial social issues, employment, education, housing, has been regularly studied. For example, in a recent study, my colleagues and I at the University of Michigan demonstrated convincingly the strong link between white stereotypes of blacks and their aversion to living among them. Stereotype use is so strong and so prevalent that it outweighs the most liberal of housing and educational attitudes. Only in the political sphere, where there is the secrecy of the ballot, does there remain less compelling empirical evidence examining the link between whites' racial attitudes and their political behavior regarding black office seekers. My recent empirical study examining this link provides fresh insight as to what may be really going on when whites step into the private confines of the voting booth. I discovered, among many things, that electoral contests featuring black and white candidates are full of what is known as racial priming. That is, largely innocuous and nonetheless constant and cognitive instructive reminders from the media that one of the candidates is black. And several striking conclusions emerge from this study. First, if one holds all factors constant, by that I mean identical credentials, political experience, personal characteristics, the white candidate in our study received far more support when competing against a black candidate. Second, whites' aversion to cast a ballot for a black candidate was strongly related to the negative attitudes, opinions, stereotypes, and characterizations they harbor about blacks as a categorical group. And third, this racial animus, not credentials, not personal character, or even political ideology, was the most significant determinant of whites' aversion to voting for the black candidate competing in a biracial contest. The voting discrimination against black political candidates was discernible, specific, purposeful, and contemporary. Giving this new and arresting empirical evidence from which more reliable inferences can be drawn, one must conclude that with few exceptions, barriers to the election of black candidates from predominantly white jurisdictions have not collapsed. There's little room to doubt that contemporary racial animus unfairly burdens black candidates who ought to have an equal opportunity to compete, not win elected office, on the basis of their qualifications, experience, issue stances, personal character, and the like. Amid the affirmative action debate, critics extol the notion of equality of opportunity, that advancement and success should now be solely predicated on the premise of individual merit and qualifications. Yet in the realm of race and politics, the empirical evidence demonstrates a disheartening reality. Far too many white Americans still are quite resistant to the election of black officials on account of race. Congressman Mel Watt of North Carolina perhaps put it best when he said, quote, "Okay, you want to be colorblind and that's fine, but we've got 30% of white people who won't vote for anybody black. How is that colorblind?" End quote. One must ponder what it says about the state of American society that 30 years after the civil rights campaigns of the 1960s, blacks who run for elected office are not afforded an equal chance to compete for white votes. Indeed, that black office seekers in the main are prevented from fairly and equally pursuing elective office on account of race suggests the continued need for remedial measures such as race-conscious legislative districting. This is neither a special privilege, a set-aside or quota, nor a means of insulating blacks from white electoral competition, as critics have suggested. Rather, it is a remedy to offset contemporary voting discrimination against black candidates on account of race. It is a laudable goal that our political system ought to encourage people to look beyond race to the qualities of individuals. I find myself in full agreement with such sentiments in an ideal world. But given present-day political and racial realities, the premise that looking beyond race will ameliorate racial prejudice and discrimination seems to me quite erroneous and misplaced. Interestingly, an episode involving Colin Powell underscores this fundamental point. Frank Carlucci, National Security Advisor in the Reagan administration, sent Powell to speak with North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms about a policy matter. Sometime later, Senator Helms relayed to Carlucci, quote, that he'd listened to that black general you sent up here, end quote. Powell tells us, now Jesse just doesn't know any other way to see folks. As cordial as Jesse and I are now, if you think Jesse can ever see me as anything other than a black general, then we would have arrived. But we ain't arrived, end quote. Sadly, too many white Americans still see black. As we ponder the contemporary state of black-white relations in America this evening, an admonition from W.E.B. Du Bois a century ago is quite instructive to keep in mind. Du Bois commented, quote, "Awful as race prejudice and ignorance are, we can fight them if we frankly face them and dare name them and tell the truth. But if we continually cloud and dodge the issue and say the half-truth because of the whole stings and shames, if we do this, we invite catastrophe," end quote. Facing up to an admitted race problem is essential if we ever hope to arrive at the day when all citizens are afforded an equal opportunity to realize their dreams and aspirations without regard to race. And it is my view that we must continue to utilize public policies to help nudge us toward fulfilling the ideal of true equal opportunity in this country. Thank you.
I wonder if they couldn't get something to back that up. Because these people will be maybe getting up.
It won't happen again because we'll all watch
Okay.
it.
Stay seated from now
All
on.
right, then, stay loose there. It's the Titanic up here. They start going this way. Professor Stephen Thernstrom.
Okay, well, I'd like to respond to the two previous speakers. Only very briefly to Professor Reeves. Much of what he said comes from his book, which I haven't had a chance to read, and I'm sure I would have some comments if I had read it. But just two quick points. His final Colin Powell story, I'm sure that's quite accurate reading of Jesse Helms, but it does seem to me the pertinent point to make about Colin Powell, surely, is that a man from an oppressed or once oppressed racial group, which constitutes a little over 12% of the population, would be a most prized candidate on the ticket of either of our major parties. He is an overwhelmingly popular figure, and even if Jesse didn't vote for him, I think he would be a clear favorite if he were in the race. Second, Professor Reeves has done these experiments showing that under certain circumstances, whites won't vote for black candidates, and that he's figured out how to determine what the kind of the quality of the candidate is to control for that. I really don't know how one could do that, but assuming that he has done it, I would prefer to turn to the most recent experience. I do recall that after the Supreme Court redrew the district lines and deprived a number of black members of Congress of their majority black districts, it was predicted that the black caucus would soon fit in the back of a taxi cab. Well, it happened that every one of those representatives, Cynthia McKinney and the rest, was reelected in their new white majority district. The most recent twist on this, which has, I think, important bearing on what Professor Reeves had to say, is that it now turns out from inspecting who is gearing up to run in the primary, the leading candidate to oppose those black incumbents in every single one of those districts is also black. Is a black female Republican who's likely to run against Cynthia McKinney. And so it doesn't seem to me that those examples actually fit with the pessimistic view that Professor Reeves suggests here. Now, as to Professor Bobo, he accuses us of indulging in mean-spirited optimism. I find myself a little thrown by that. I don't quite see how it can be mean-spirited to be optimistic, but he, to the contrary, is out there, honestly discovering and reporting the cancer that is eating away at our national life. Now, my feeling is that what he has read as signs of cancer, the studies he cites specifically, do not in fact reveal cancer at work, and I think it is very misleading and dangerous to describe as a cancer something which is only an ulcer or whatever the proper medical analogy would be. Thus, he tells us that 78% of whites believe that blacks prefer to be on welfare. Now, I frankly don't know where that number comes from and how that question was asked. He tells me it was a 1990 study. I have here a 1994 study, so perhaps things have just changed. But they are so different. This is a Harris poll conducted for the National Conference, in which one specific question was, do you believe blacks want to live on welfare? And not 78%, but 21% of whites held that negative stereotype. And it's quite interesting to note that Hispanics and Asians were asked the same question. And 26% of Hispanics and 31% of Asians held those negative stereotypes. So whatever negative stereotype problems we may have as we move into an increasingly multiracial society, we certainly will need a multi-pronged attack on it, which does not focus only on ignorant or biased whites. And indeed, one of the most interesting findings of this survey is that blacks hold stronger negative stereotypes against Hispanics, Asians, and Jews than any other group. So there is some need for improvement in attitudes within the black community as well. Then we have Professor Bobo telling us that 56% of whites believe that blacks are less intelligent. And again, I don't know where that number comes from, and that's a particularly troubling and I think wildly misleading number, because in fact we have a consistent time series. Professor Bobo reprints part of it in his book with Schumann, Racial Attitudes in America. Going back to the early 40s, we have a consistent question about racial differences in intelligence, in which the question is asked, are blacks as intelligent as whites, and goes on to define intelligence, which his study he's referring to may not. And that is, they can learn as well as whites if given the same education or training. And if you look at that time series, there is a consistent pattern from half of all whites believing in the intellectual inferiority of blacks, dropping down to about 20% by the early 80s. Continuing down, he mentions and makes much of the bell curve, so let us note that in the year the bell curve was published, but before it was published, this question was asked, 14% of whites said they thought blacks were less intelligent. After the bell curve has been published and digested in 1996, how much did the figure go up as a result of the publication of this pernicious book? It actually went down from 14% to 10%. So I know David Shipler uses a different figure, and I find Shipler's discussion of this completely misleading for reasons I'll go into if any of you want. Then Professor Bobo, I'm just puzzled here and need some clarification. He declares that no African American is a member of the white middle class, and I really didn't understand what he means. I mean, I would say likewise, there are no Christians in the Jewish middle class. I mean, that is, if the white is an adjective modifying members of the middle class, then by definition, there are no blacks members of the white middle class, they're members of the black middle class. So this is puzzling to me. Now, he then goes on, the final point I want to develop a little here, to make various comparisons about the economic status of the two races, to look at rates of poverty, income levels, and particularly differences in wealth. And he draws on the Oliver and Shapiro study, which looks at household differences in wealth and finds, indeed, enormous disparities. I find it puzzling that he would cite that study without at least addressing at all the question of controls for family structure. It happens that a huge source of inequality in the distribution of wealth as well as income in our society today is that increasingly the white middle class is made up of two-paycheck families. And increasingly black households are consisting of single-parent, largely female-headed households. And it comes as no surprise at all to know that mothers who often are high school dropouts, mothers who are very often dependent on AFDC to feed their children, are not accumulating a lot of wealth. A meaningful comparison between the races would hold family structure constant. And we would ask whether black two-parent households with, say, two professionals earning in the 100,000 a year and up, well, how their wealth compares with that of comparably situated whites. Now, I'm sure you would find, no one has yet done that to my knowledge, you would certainly find some differences because blacks are relatively recently arrived at a point where they can indeed earn high incomes and accumulate wealth, as are a great many Mexican Americans. There's a recency so that I would expect a difference, but I do think it is really quite mistaken and wildly misleading to suggest these gross differences in household wealth, reflect some rampant discrimination. And the same point, I can't go on in detail, but precisely the same point can be made with respect to differences in income or levels of poverty. If we look at levels of child poverty among two-parent black households, for example, they are almost identical with those of whites. 85% of all poor black children today, 85% live in one kind of household. They live with their mother and no father. That's a mighty strong correlation for social science. So I would suggest if we control for differences in family structure, the differences that he thinks are so large are quite modest. Most recently, the income difference, final sentence, between black and white families with two parents, blacks earned only 13% less than whites, and the remaining differences can be reduced largely to the fact blacks are more heavily concentrated in the South, where wage levels are lower, and blacks have a lower rate of college graduation. So among stable two-parent households, you have something quite close to economic equality. That's optimism. I don't think it's mean-spirited optimism.
Obviously, you have heard a very divergent, very passionate emoting from all sides. This is an issue and has been for centuries, 2 centuries, not that long for brother against brother in this country. An issue of emotion, fear, guilt, racism, passion, deep feeling, incendiary topic, and I hope that we will direct your attack to the ideas and not to the persons as you ask your questions. We have a rule in the Senate when we're doing heavy lifting, which is called, you will direct your remarks to the chair. Now, we don't have that rule in the Institute of Politics, but we want to remember that if you will direct your attack to the ideas that are presented and not to the person, I think that will help clarify some of it. So I won't even attempt to ask a question first to get things rolling. So roll them up, and I'll try to recognize people. If somebody could help spot, because sometimes we'll go to this microphone first and then proceed alternately. Thank you. Please.
Hi.
If you may direct your question to...
Yes, this question is directed for Abigail Thernstrom. It's a 2-part question, and just moving back from the numbers a bit, in your book, your most recent book, American Black and White, you paint race-conscious policies as having pernicious consequences for our progress towards the ideal of a colorblind society, distinguishing only in an obscure footnote between race-conscious policies that promote equal opportunity and those aimed at equal outcomes. However, in your December Newsweek article, you refer more explicitly to a, quote, right approach to, or, quote, a proper kind of affirmative action, a, quote, widening of the net, as you put it. I would like you to first clarify your inconsistent position on race-conscious policies. Second, in your book, you admit that much progress has yet to be made, as you did tonight. Your policy proposal that flows from your assertion is clear. Remove race-conscious policies and our race-conscious society will magically become less so. Raise standards in schools, and black students will magically rise to the occasion and proceed on the road to success. You hold that, quote, the real solution, as you put it, is to, quote, attack the problem of K through 12 education. I would like to ask you then, as member of the Massachusetts Board of Education, what substantive steps have you taken to attack this problem? Thanks.
Yes, please.
Well, those are very good questions, and let me take the latter first. I don't have a magic wand. As one of 9 members on the Massachusetts State Board of Education to do what I would like to see done. Massachusetts is involved in implementing a 1993 educational reform law. We'll see what that looks like at the end of the day in terms of its actual implementation. It does involve higher standards and accountability attached to those standards. And one of the problems that other states, and I suspect we're going to run into here in this state, although the climate is a bit changing in terms of nationwide, in terms of the imposition of educational standards. But one of the problems that other states run into in trying to set high standards and really have accountability attached to those standards, have stakes attached to those standards, is that there are a lot of very nervous people who say, but wait a minute, it's going to have a disparate racial and ethnic impact. That is, whites and Asians are going to do okay, and blacks and Hispanics aren't going to do okay. Well, I don't buy into that patronizing, demeaning view. My view is to say to teachers, all kids can learn equally well. Don't you tell me we've got to dumb down standards in order to make sure that there is no racial gap. You make sure there is no racial gap by teaching all kids equally well. And I don't believe for a minute that can't be done. We've got schools across this country that are taking highly disadvantaged kids and educating them extremely well. Now, a lot of those schools, some of them are public schools. Some of them are public schools of a new sort, that is charter schools, independent schools. A lot of them are parochial schools. And when you've got, for instance, the public school system in Washington, D.C. now spending almost $10,000, no, I think it's over $10,000 per pupil, and one of the members of the D.C. school board saying we're talking about ethnic genocide here because of the outcome, educational outcome, my view is, yeah, let every one of those kids out. With public dollars, that is what's called the V word, vouchers. I would call them low-income scholarships because I would only make them available to low-income kids. Let them out into the schools with public money that can teach those kids well. Now, as a member of the Massachusetts State Board of Education, am I going to be able to put in place those low-income scholarships? Never. So what I would really like to see in terms of education ain't going to happen by, as you said, magically, or by my presence on the board. But I do my best to make sure that the standards are real and that the stakes attached to those standards, and that we don't have any kind of demeaning, patronizing, dumbing down of those standards because of a short-term racial and ethnic gap in academic performance.
Right.
Second place on the...
I think
Okay.
there's such a short period of time. We're going to have shorter questions
Okay,
and shorter
sorry.
answers. Okay.
Sorry, I'd
Yeah.
be delighted to address it
I
after.
think so. Let me go around this young lady here, then to this microphone, then here, and then back here. And short answers and short questions. That's the only way you're going to gain something in the evening. Okay?
Hi, this question is directed to the Thornstroms. I was just wondering if you could clarify some statements in your recent book, because on page 357 you state with regard to gaps in cognitive skills between blacks and whites, and I quote, "Much has changed since the mid-1980s, and it is all for the worse." You claim that the statistics from the National Assessment of Education Progress show an increasing gap. The truth is that most recent data from the NAEP shows this gap shrinking not only in the sciences, but also in reading and writing. And can you please explain this egregious error?
I will comment on your thoroughly misleading assertion. No, I mean, we're dependent on data published through 1994. The 1994 NAEP assessments were the last data available to us when the book went to press, and we have a table there that I think demonstrates very clearly that blacks were catching up to whites from the first NAEP tests around 1970 to the late 1980s. We're focusing on 17-year-olds, but you've seen the same pattern for 13-year-olds and 9-year-olds, the other two age groups touched upon. And then in the late 80s, that progress comes to a halt and the gap between the races widens. And we devote a lot of pages to trying to explain that, but we say, frankly, we're stumped. We're not satisfied that our chapter really satisfactorily resolves that question as to why it happened. Now, since then, I've just gotten the most recent NAEP data and have only begun to analyze it, but I certainly don't recognize the pattern you see in it. There was a slight turnaround in reading, a matter of like 2 months worth of reading skill at the 17-year-old level, but basically the gap has not narrowed, and certainly it has not narrowed back to where it was in the late 1980s. If you think it has, I would love to see, send me some tables, because I would love to see how you've calculated it. That's not how I read the evidence.
Well, and also Christopher Jenks at the Kennedy School here, who's out at Stanford this year, however, has got a volume coming out on this, and he has exactly our picture.
This question right here to this microphone. Yes, young man, right,
Hi.
please.
My name is Raphael Mandelman, and I'm a student at the Kennedy School. My question, I come from California. So I have a question about sort of higher education and affirmative action in higher education for the Thurnstroms. In California, we are in the process of dismantling affirmative action, and the results so far have been disturbing. There is one African American in the first year class at Bolt Hall. That's one out of about 250. And I'm wondering if the Thurnstroms, how they feel about affirmative action in higher education, if they think it's a bad idea, if they think that the tests, the LSATs, the SATs, the MCATs are such good predictors of the contribution a person can make to society that it's worth not having black lawyers or black doctors.
Yeah, unfortunately, I would love to talk to you about that for a half an hour or more. We've written a long chapter about it. I've written a number of papers since then, one of them in the current issue of the Public Interest I recommend you look at on California specifically, another article on law school admissions and the performance of black affirmative action admits on the bar exam in the December commentary, and a law review version of that is coming out shortly. The short answer is, one, you've grossly exaggerated the extent of change by taking the one example of Bolt Hall. Black enrollment in the 5 medical schools of the state of California is not down 80% or 70%, but 23%. And the gain of that is that now all of those black students are accepted as full equals, having been admitted under the same standards as everyone else. Asian enrollments in California are up dramatically, 83% at UCLA Law School, for example. So the notion all these gains are going to whites is quite misleading. And the core fact is that our aim is not to get minority students into any one law school or medical school or anything else. It's to get them through those schools successfully and to get them to qualify themselves professionally. And the cruel fact is, maybe this is mean-spirited optimism, the cruel fact is those tests are tests and GPAs are very highly predictive of your ability to pass the bar exam or to pass the medical boards. 43% of blacks admitted to law school in the fall of 1991 under affirmative action programs either failed to complete law school or flunked the bar exam, some of them taking it as many as 6 times over 3 years. That data is in the commentary article, and it's very sobering. So you're not doing students a favor to let them into a school where they will predictably be at the very bottom of the class. They will be much better off. Black enrollment is not down at the law school at the University of California, Davis. Students who would have gotten into Berkeley or UCLA before got into Davis this year. Those students belong at Davis. They will be average students at Davis. They would have been at the bottom of the class and were historically at the bottom of the class all too often at Bolt Hall and UCLA.
This young lady, please, at this microphone.
My name is Ellen Holloman. I'm a student at Harvard Law School, and I have a question for you, Mr. Thernstrom.
Are there any questions for the other two panelists? Because this is very important. We are in a discussion, and when you're in a discussion, we just can't have a single array of questions directed to one set of panelists and not to the others. So I ask that question quite honestly. Okay, fine. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
I read your book, America in Black and White, and one of the reasons that it sounded so hollow to me and why I think that it is seriously flawed is because you fail to discuss or even acknowledge in any significant way the very real existence of the history of white racism, white violence, and white oppression against blacks and other minorities. I want to know, why do you not include such a discussion in your book? Because as a historian, I think it is really poor scholarship on your part to fail to place the inauguration of affirmative action programs in their proper historical context, which is George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door. And Bull
you didn't
Connor,
find any discussion of George Wallace
No,
in my book?
if we could finish
Excuse
the
me,
question,
yeah.
please.
which is Bull Connor driving through the streets of Birmingham in a white tank and people turning fire hoses and German shepherds on school children, and the many other instances which accompanied an integration which were extremely violent. I also want to bring up to you, in your own teaching
May we please have a short
experience-
question? I respectfully request that.
Okay, this is the question I want to know. In your own teaching experience at Harvard, you have experienced harsh criticism from your basically insensitive treatment of these issues. In 1988, you taught a class, The Peopling of America, and you said that black men are threatened by white women who are doing well in society. Why do you think that
no,
black
that's
men
total
beat their
nonsense.
wives?
Please, if we can.
I
let's-
have this
your
article
source of
from the
evidence?
Harvard
Just
Crimson.
a moment, please. If you would finish your question, and we'll have a response,
I
please.
want you to respond to your omission of white racism in your book and to your comments
Yes, I'd
in
be
this
delighted
class.
to respond.
No.
I must say this is it's an out-of-body experience. That is, I submit to you, there are copies of the book around. Let's have a little bet or something. See if George Wallace is in the index. See if Bull Connor is in the index. See if a vivid description of police dogs, fire hoses, and so on is not there. I mean, this is absolutely amazing.
First third of the book
The whole
is on
first third of the
nothing
book is
else.
Please.
the history. So this is mind-boggling. As to the charge that I said something about black men being threatened by white women, I mean, I don't know what the source of that
The
preposterous
source
claim
of this is the Harvard Crimson.
Oh,
issued in
well,
February
then it
1988.
must be true. Oh, all right.
Got to see what they say about me in there.
Not seriously. You're not serious.
Excuse me?
No, I think she
I'm
is very
completely
serious, and I don't
I think
take.
that
Come on.
it's extremely
Yeah,
relevant that you would.
Next.
May we, I'm going to go on to the next question, please, and right here to this microphone, because we have a limited amount of time. Yes.
This is also directed to Thernstrom's. So, I mean, if someone wants to ask a question for Professor Reeves, or I'll go after you.
Yes, well, let's have a question for Professor Reeves or Professor Boble. Please, do you have a question for them?
Yeah, my name is Jared Genzer. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I want to, for a moment, turn away from the past, although we obviously live as a result of it, and look to the future in terms of how to address some of these issues and problems. I'm curious as to, I mean, anyone on the panel, but particularly Professor Reeves or Bobo, given that you all haven't had much airtime recently, as to what your feelings are about the President's initiative on race, and whether you feel dialogue is the best way to approach the breaking down of barriers in the future. I say that only because I'm doing my master's thesis on the role of national service programs in breaking down barriers between people of different backgrounds. And there are a lot of positive things that are actually being done to bring people together to achieve a superordinate goal, that being of strengthening communities that can actually do a lot of effective things. And I think dialogue is part of the solution, but not the only part, and I'm curious as to what other policy ideas you all have in mind.
I'll go first.
You may both
quickly.
respond if you wish, whatever.
Yeah, I think President Clinton is right to initiate a dialogue precisely because our understanding of the problem of race in America is now so distorted. For example, drawing on Professor Thernstrom's remarks, there's this sense in which the difference in black and white family structure is just a variable out in the air that explains why African Americans are disadvantaged for some race-neutral reason or causality. Nothing could be more preposterous if you study African American history and develop an understanding of the forces that created a pattern of substantial difference in African American family structure. So to say that that explains why there's this incidental difference in wealth between blacks and whites is part of the strange, bizarre optimism that I hear from...
As long as it's not mean-spirited.
Yeah, I'm going to get back to that, but part of the problem here. So we have to have a dialogue that clarifies the profound, powerful effects of race in America so that when someone says, well, the real problem is family structure, many people who don't think very systematically just go, aha, that's it, black folks just don't maintain stable families. As though there aren't historical reasons for that, and as though race isn't an integral, fundamental component of that distinction. And by the way, black-white couples compared to, married couples compared to white married couples still have less than a third the wealth in 1994 as compared to white couples, and it's a staggering sum of money that has profound effects on the quality of life. Secondly, and I'll just finish on the part about stereotyping, which I think is something Clinton's race initiative can speak to. There's a new technology in survey research for measuring stereotypes, which a book you cite frequently employs to some degree, Paul Snyderman. Snyderman's figures on the level of anti-black stereotyping are at least double, if not treble, those you quoted from Harris here. So again, today's kind of selective presentation of evidence as often appears to be the case. But secondly, the specific figures I presented in the talk here today come from the 1990 General Social Survey, which you cite whenever it supports a conclusion you want to draw upon. I might add those figures have now been confirmed in studies by the American National Election Study. Those two are the standard in social science research for survey research on stereotyping data. So those very low figures, they happen because they're the type of question that were originally written in the 1940s. And the character of stereotyping is very different from today than it was in 1940. George Wallace isn't walking around talking about segregation now and forever and keeping the darkies in their place. Stereotyping is far more sophisticated, and you have to have a measurement technology that speaks to that. By the way, I can wear a $1,000 suit and still not get a taxi in New York at this hour of night. And I want to tell you, there's a reason for that. And it's not because some minor 10% of the white population has a negative stereotype of blacks.
No, it's because...
And a lot of those taxi drivers will be black themselves who will not pick you up.
That's right. Blacks will
just a
also be
moment. I'd
affected
like
by
to-
these stereotypes. That's not the point here. The last thing on policy recommendations is affirmative action is not the problem, it's the solution. And that's the key thing I want to underscore here. As we lift the pressure off for affirmative action,
Please,
as
there'll
we
be
lift the
time for
pressure
that.
off for affirmative action, the dynamic of racial discrimination, the powerful effect of these stereotypes that are still out there, though quite different from what they were in the past, are going to ratchet right back into action and recreate the sort of racial inequality that you rather optimistically tell us we should no longer be concerned about.
I would just
Keith,
add
go
Is
ahead.
that what we say?
I would just add a couple things, if I can get in here for a moment. I think the educational piece is quite central. I'm also under no illusions that the President's Commission on Race is going to solve this problem in a year span. Also, what is, seems to me quite glaring omission is that there's no discussion of the media and the press's role in this fueling and or helping to bridge this racial divide. I think that's a central component. I would also, if I may not get a chance to do this, respond
Please,
to
Keith, go
Stephen,
ahead.
and that is that it is possible with very, very clever, carefully designed studies to disentangle whether in fact it's racial discrimination that's causing whites not to vote for black candidates, or whether it's ideology, or whether it's partisanship, or whether it's a whole range of other things. The other point I would add is that these guys who won in 1996, the folks who were reelected in these redistricted areas, won primarily because of the power of incumbency. Cynthia McKinney, who was the first black congresswoman from the state of Georgia, had to raise nearly $1 million to defeat someone who had never held public office. I mean, just amazing. $1 million to defeat someone who had never, ever held public office. Also, what's interesting is if you look at what is the percentage of the white vote that these black candidates got, Stanford Bishop, who comes from the state of Georgia, who is an ideal candidate from the Durham's point of view because he is pretty much low salience on race. He represents a primarily agricultural district, got 36% of the white vote. Cynthia McKinney got 31% of the white vote. I'm not saying under any circumstances that black candidates always lose elections on the basis of race. What I am saying is that too many white Americans see black, they're cued by the media, and when they step into the voting booth, again, the confessional, if you will, they step into the voting booth and all, that racial animus rears its ugly head, and that's my point. And I'm not sure if you got that quite well.
Okay, thank you. And this young lady with a question here, please.
Hi, my name is Rashma Sajani. I'm also a master's student here at the Kennedy School. This question is directed to the Thurnstroms. On page 409 of your book, America in Black and White, you write, and I quote, "Non-academic factors, as being a child of an alumnus or having special athletic or musical talent, are given much less weight than race in the admissions decisions of most schools. However, according to the Hastings Con Law Journal, more white students gain entry to Harvard College as legacies than the total number of black, Hispanic, and Native American students together. At both Harvard and Yale, legacy applicants who are overwhelmingly white and affluent are accepted at over twice the overall admissions rate. What I find disturbing about your book is that you attempt to argue that preferences in all contexts are harmful and unjust, but you fallaciously justify legacies. In addition to that, you do not even discuss preferences for women, the main beneficiaries of affirmative action, whose test scores and grades are significantly lower than white men. The question I pose to you, Mr. and Mrs. Thurmstrom, is why attack race and not preference? Or does it just take a big book to tell a big fat lie?
Come on. Yes, please. Your response. You probably have one.
I think the questioner has somewhat misunderstood the discussion of alumni preferences. I have no brief for alumni preferences. I don't give a damn. And I have no brief whatever for athletic preferences either. I made the point that the data we've seen, and there's a lot of it, suggests that racial preferences are of a much greater magnitude than any alumni preferences I've seen. I've seen data for quite a number of places. At Harvard specifically, you can't simply say a student is a legacy student, meaning a legacy applicant, meaning they have parents or ancestors who went to Harvard, and simply say they got in, therefore it's because of that. I've seen data, and I've served on the Harvard College Admissions Committee for 5 years, so I know something about this process from the inside. I recall studies showing that the admitted alumni children had higher GPAs and higher SATs than non-alumni children. So it's very complicated, but I have no brief whatever for any form of preference. Whether private schools want to do it is one kind of question. I think it is totally obnoxious and unacceptable for the University of Michigan or the University of California to be giving alumni preference, racial preference, or any other kind of preference.
Well, there's another point here, that even if you want to argue for, let's say, athletic preferences or veteran, whatever, race is special in this country. We didn't fight a civil war over athletic equality. The 14th Amendment isn't about athletic equality. Race is special, and there is a reason why it's a suspect category in our law, because it should be, given our rotten history of racial subjugation.
Given our rotten history, shouldn't diversity be a positive policy goal, though?
No, you are assuming that it is possible for wise social planners to make racial discriminations in a way that will be beneficial. And we are more skeptical of the ability of decision makers to do that, and we see many other negative consequences. Certainly at highly selective institutions. The fundamental problem for blacks today in higher education is not access to college. Blacks are going to college at 80% the white rate. The fundamental problem is they're dropping out of college. They're only graduating at a 55% rate.
Let's go back.
We think that has to do in part with affirmative action.
I want to go back to the students. Right up here, please.
I have to apologize, I'm not a student here. My name's Abra Siegel. I'm a criminal prosecutor in this county, in Middlesex County. And my question is directed to Professors Reeves and Bobo. In my job as a criminal prosecutor, I see, unfortunately, a lot of the problems with overrepresentation of African Americans being prosecuted. And I think there are problems with race that come in the criminal justice system too. My question is, as a concrete matter, if you two would be able to name the number one thing you would like, number one policy initiative you would like to see happen to affect today the lives of the people at the bottom of the economic and social scale in the cities, like in Lowell, for example, where you have complete breakdown of a sense of law and order, and what you would do for those, where you have the large numbers of single-parent families and drug abuse, and what you would do for that population if you could name your number one initiative.
Sure. Let me take this through a personal anecdote. I came out of inner city Chester, Pennsylvania, and what was important in terms of how I got to where I am at this point in my mind was a series of programs, A Better Chance, Upper Bound program, which really gave a lot of us an alternative. That is an alternative way of looking at all kinds of other options, an emphasis on education, an emphasis on math, science, English. We were exposed to college environments very early, given all of these sort of SAT preparation and so forth. And these kinds of programs, Swarthmore College, where I was at the time, has the most successful program in the country. It's been running for something like 30, 35 years. It is the model, and it has shown just wonderful, wonderful effects. 92% of the folks who come in graduate from high school. Something like 60 to 65% actually go on to college and actually finish. And so from my perspective, on a personal note, would be that those kinds of programs are extraordinarily, extraordinarily important and quite effective.
I would just quickly tack on to that. I won't take a great deal of time. That whatever is done has to be a multi-pronged effort. Unfortunately, the nature and magnitude of these problems is such that there is no magic bullet that's going to solve it all. I think William Julius Wilson is right that one of the central things we have to emphasize is a better employment policy, in particular for those in inner city communities. But in conjunction with that, we really have to fight the radical distribution of income and wealth upward that is the legacy of the Reagan-Bush years. And unless something is done to make our tax structure a more progressive one, unless something is done to assure that economic growth also works to minimize inequality, rather than shunting hundreds of thousands of people into low-wage jobs with no benefits and no prospects for promotion and advancement, then we're going to be in real trouble in those communities. And it's those sorts of things we've got to address. Lastly, to tackle the racial component of it, we need an absolutely vigorous, unequivocal commitment to destroying racial discrimination in the workplace and in the housing market. And I try to take the Thernstrom and others at their words, that they really do believe in racial justice and that everyone is now committed to that. If that's true, an unequivocal, all-out war on racial discrimination ought to be declared. We know what the techniques are to fight these things. Let's make it a number one priority. Let's hold the rhetoric to the test and say, all right, stomp it out for good.
Right here, this microphone, please.
I'd like to speak to the issue of stereotyping, and I think there's a terrible mistake being made here because the negative assessments that white people make of black people are basically correct, and it's a terrible myth to pretend that they are somehow pathological or mistaken or based on ignorance or any such thing. They are not mistaken. They are very true. And also the whole idea of racism by maintaining that white racial attitudes are somehow pathological or based on ignorance is simply itself creating a negative racial stereotype of white people. That's what political correctness is doing. It is engaged in the attempt to construct a negative racial stereotype of white people and use that as the basis to construct, a politically correct society in which white people will be the permanent victims of people of color.
Can I
Well, yeah,
answer
please. This is what an education is all about. Exactly. what it is. So please.
I mean, I was about to say, I mean, ironically, I'm thrilled that you're here. I mean, on the one hand, I've been told stereotypes don't exist. On the other hand, they're transparently true.
Hey, wait a minute. Hey, wait a minute.
No.
Neither of us said stereotypes didn't exist. Why are our arguments so
I'm sorry.
distorted?
I've heard all four of you use the word stereotype all evening, so I wouldn't worry about who's using it. All four of you have used it throughout the evening, your word stereotype.
The point that I would attempt to quickly make is that a stereotype is different from a simple statement about average rates of some occurrence or behavior. So, for example, blacks are arrested and incarcerated more than whites. Does that mean that blacks are dispositionally more prone to violence? And it's that sort of perception that the stereotype tries to get at.
Well, that's the truth.
Secondly,
They are proportionally more disposed.
Please, let's hear this man.
You're missing the point.
Here's the
Secondly,
question.
the critical nature about a stereotype is that it's a categorical judgment, that you apply it to people without gaining the individuating or individualizing information that all of us truly want to be judged by, that all of us want to be measured by the characteristics we bring to the situation as an individual. So even if there's some average rate difference out there, it is always, from the social psychologist's vantage point, and I think from the vantage point of the highest values of a democratic society, it is always correct to look to the individual characteristic and not to some group or cultural characteristic if you can get the appropriate diagnostic or individuating information. So the application of the stereotyping is flawed. And then thirdly, I will say, the best evidence we have suggests that these stereotypes are only mildly responsive to real information. They have a great capacity to recreate themselves and exist irrespective of a lot of contradictory, falsifying information. That is, they are centrally irrational. There's a kernel of truth, as something about your comments indicated to them, but they do not function in anything that remotely approximates a reasoned or intellectually sensible manner.
Do you, just to this question here, this young lady, please.
Hi, my name is Afra. I'm a senior at the college, and this is a question for the entire panel. We're going to go back to the affirmative action debate, which has produced sort of a topsy-turvy world where King, probably rolling in his grave, finds himself the poster boy of the conservative position to dismantle affirmative action. And oftentimes he's soundbited by his 1964 speech where he says, you know, he invokes this for little children, content of the character, not color of their skin. Yet Professor Bobo brought up tonight that in his last works, Where We Go From Here, King is unequivocally a supporter of preferential progress, and he sees that the first stage was in fact civil rights, which was successful in terms of the legislation passed, but King clearly saw that there was also a need for social rights, whereby affirmative action would become necessary. So if you, with the entire panel comment on either, one, the use of King by the conservatives, or two, if King in fact was wrong and the 1964 speech stands, as opposed to where we go from here.
Please.
I'll quickly quote from Dr. King. Thank you, Afra.
Why don't you all take a swing at that one, and we'll wind her up.
It is, however, important to understand that giving a man his due, apologies to 1968, may often mean giving him special treatment. I am aware of the fact that this has been a troublesome concept for many liberals, since it conflicts with their traditional ideal of equal opportunity and equal treatment of people according to their individual merits. But this is a day which demands new thinking and reevaluation of old concepts. A society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something special for him and her in order to equip them to compete on a just and equal basis.
Keith, did you have any?
No, I would just add, I think, as far as I'm concerned, the equal opportunity piece is so central, and to the extent that race discrimination and racial prejudice and racial bias, racial animus impede my opportunity to run for elective office, to buy a car, to get the housing of my choice, that's a serious public policy problem that has to be adequately addressed.
Did you?
I don't want to fight over what is the voice of the true Reverend Martin Luther King. I would simply say that I think that the message that ran through the whole civil rights movement of the late 50s and early 60s, which was precisely that message in the 64 speech, that individuals must be treated, 63 speech, I'm sorry, that individuals must be treated as individuals, that there is no other road to equality, that indeed, as Professor Bobo said, the alternative is to traffic in stereotypes, and that when indeed we treat blacks as fungible members of groups, then inevitably there are going to be group hierarchies in the society, and blacks are going to lose out, as they have historically, by being treated as first and foremost not individuals, but members of a group. So, you know, whatever the true Martin Luther King was, at the end of the day, that message still rings true for me. Is there data out there that can tell me that my judgment call on that is right and others are wrong? No, at the end of the day, it is a judgment call, because it's looking into the future and making the best guess I can about what will bring us together as a nation, and that is the bottom line for me in any public policy. Will it bring us together? And my judgment is to ratchet up race consciousness in this already highly race-conscious society, and to treat people on the basis of the color of their skin ain't going to get us where we want to go.
Let me say that I think we'll have to bring it to an end. They tell me these things do end at 9:30, and then but tomorrow night, oh, for those of you that haven't had nearly enough, tomorrow night I announce the Black Students Association. Diane, you have given me this. Diane Fraser, the Black Students Association and the College Democrats, a discussion tomorrow night. I will be the moderator. And
He's a real masochist.
Yeah, you ain't kidding. They get you involved in this place. Tomorrow night at 9:30 p.m. in Lamont Forum Room, and we'll be discussing race in America, and it will be a conversation. And it will be, I will be honored to moderate. Let me just say thank you so much. It's a classic example of the old phrase, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but nobody's entitled to their own facts. And there's sure a lot of facts here that are sure bouncing all over the place, and this is what an education is about, to sort it out, and go read it, put it in your own heart, and decide what you want to do with it. I want to thank you all. Thank you particularly for your courtesy to the panelists. I did not say a word, and I thought I was very good. However, right now, no. There is one stereotype. I don't want you to throw a thing, but it comes from the use of a stereotype called the Bush-Reagan years. Because during those years, I was there, and I watched John Chafee and Jack Danforth and Bob Dole and Bill Cohen and Warren Rudman work very hard. And to say that the Reagan years were, quote, simply hostile to civil rights and affirmative action and opened the door to greater racial discrimination, those were comments that I read today. That's a stereotype, and that ought to be examined just as carefully as any other. Thank you very much.
Have you met Professor Ogletree?
Oh, Charles.
I just did a cross the aisle from each other a few years ago.